perfectly competitive markets diagram, let's jump right into it. Okay, so for perfectly competitive markets, even before labeling your diagram, the first thing you need to remember is that there are two diagrams. And the first one is the market diagram, excuse my handwriting, and the second one is the firm. So the only difference between these two is that the market, as you can imagine, is built up of several firms. Could be several hundred firms, for example, but the firm diagram is the singular individual firm. So your next step here is going to be labeling your axes, and is exactly the same as other market structures diagrams. So y-axis, yet again, just cost / revenue, and x-axis will just be quantity, yet again. Also, in perfectly competitive markets, your y-axis isn't the most important. You can label it pounds, you can label it price, for example, so there's lots of different labels here. But I just used to stick to the ones I've used for the other diagrams of cost and revenue, just because it makes it a bit easier. So your market diagram looks like this. Firstly, we have our supply curve, and then just simple demand curve. And the main thing here is where they intersect. So your intersection between your supply and demand will give you, I would be doing this with a ruler, so PE and then quantity QE. Now, your next step from here is going from your market equilibrium, so where PE and QE are, and then just going right, and I do this with a ruler, of course, and then now, when this point hits your firm diagram, you would draw a horizontal line from here, and now this would be your demand equals AR equals MR curve. So that would look something like this, going from your equilibrium point, using a ruler, going straight right, and then when you reach your firm diagram, drawing a straight horizontal line, and that would be your demand equals average revenue equals marginal revenue curve. Now, one of the main mistakes students make with the perfectly competitive market diagram is this curve. Your demand equals average revenue equals marginal revenue. The main thing here is you're just expected to recall this. So whenever you're drawing a perfectly competitive markets firm diagram, always make sure you label your demand curve is equal to AR is equal to MR, and that's the main thing students will forget. Now, thinking back to the monopoly diagram, which two curves are we missing on the firm diagram? They would be our two cost curves, MC and AC. So let's add them in. Simple AC curve looking something like this, and then like we know, MC intersects AC at its lowest point, so looking something like that. Lastly, let's find the box of supernormal profit. So where the firm's profit maximize, as you know, MC equals MR, so that would be at this point here where them two curves intersect. So from where MC intersects MR, I would go down from there to now find Qmax. Then go up from the Qmax quantity until I hit my AC curve. Go left from there. Now this will give me the box of supernormal profit. That's all there is for the perfectly competitive market diagram. Just make sure you remember, firstly, label up the box of supernormal profit. Make sure to remember your demand curve equals AR equals MR, and then the way you derive your firm's demand curve is from the intersection of where supply equals demand on your market curve. Moving on, just a quick recap on the diagram and adding a few more notes. So firstly, axes, and remembering the main thing, there are two diagrams. There's one market diagram and one firm diagram. Then remembering the market diagram is comprised of many firms, and the market curve is modelled by a simple supply and demand curve. And the main thing about the market diagram is the intersection point of where supply equals demand, the equilibrium point. We use this equilibrium point on the market diagram to determine the position of our demand curve on our firm diagram. And the way we do this, go from the equilibrium point, use a ruler, go straight right, and draw a horizontal line, which will be, remember, the main thing is your demand curve equals AR curve equals MR curve. Now, you may be wondering why there is a name of a serial killer in brackets, but I think his second name is quite a good way to remember the demand equals AR equals MR curve. So D equals AR, so AR, and then MR, because MER, just get rid of the E. So if you're struggling to remember your D equals AR equals MR curve, just remember Jeffrey's second name. Then lastly, just finishing off with your simple cost curves and adding that profit maximization point, just like you would in a monopoly diagram. Now, there's two little details we haven't covered, which I used to use quite a lot in my chains of analysis, so let's cover them here. So firstly, what is the PED of a perfectly competitive markets demand curve? So if you remember back to when we were drawing the diagram, it's completely horizontal. So what will the elasticity be? It's perfectly elastic, and the PED of a perfectly elastic demand curve will have a PED of minus infinity. And I don't think that's the hardest detail to remember. We've got perfect competition, and what is a demand curve? Perfectly elastic. Now, what does this perfectly elastic demand curve show? And it links really well to one of the characteristics. Since the curve is perfectly horizontal, it shows any changes in price will lead to zero consumer demand. So if firms try to increase price, maybe to chase more supernormal profit, it will lead to absolutely zero consumer demand. And this is exactly why we call firms in a perfectly competitive market, they are price takers. Now, if you think about that spectrum of market structures with perfect competition on the left and on the polar opposite, monopolies on the right. Now, monopolies, we say they have monopoly power. So they have power to set prices in the market. Whereas, if you think about the other end of the spectrum, perfect competition, we say they are price takers, and this is due to the nature of their perfectly elastic horizontal demand curve. And of course, we can show this perfectly elastic nature on the diagram itself. So for example, the market price is £5, but for example, if a firm wants to charge £7, which would be somewhere around here, look at how much demand the firm would get. Absolutely zero. So it shows any change in price from £5, even a decrease in price, will lead to a firm having absolutely no demand from consumers.